When we look at chapters 3 and 4, Paul changes the direction of the narrative here, the argument, and he's really now addressing kind of the theology and the rationality of what's going on in the gospel that he's preached versus the false gospel that the Judaizers have come in and started to push people to adopt. And what are some of the arguments here that Paul makes from a theological or rational standpoint?
He's really pitting the law and say the promise and grace kind of at one another, and he has to kind of establish that grace is the means by which we are saved, but then he has to say, well, then what was the law given for, and kind of pave that road.
Yeah, so there's basically he's trying to point out that there's a fundamental misunderstanding of the purpose of the law and the nature of the law that is being engaged in here by his opposition. And really, he kind of points out this issue that Abraham never received the law. The Jewish people like to trace their lineage back to Abraham, but Abraham was never a law follower. And so from his perspective, from Paul's perspective, what is then the place of the law, and what does it have to do with the promise?
So at this point, as you pointed out, he takes pains to recognize that, that the promise was made to Abraham before he was even circumcised, let alone before the law was given to the children of Israel. But he says that the law, as kind of read at the beginning, it was a tutor to lead us to Christ. It was a tool, so to speak, to lead us to Christ. And separate from us leading us to Christ, its value is greatly less than what it would be.
He points something out that's really interesting, where he says that there was a promise made to Abraham and his offspring, and he points out it's not his offsprings, it's his offspring. What is he getting at with that argument? Because I think that becomes hard for us as modern people to really understand what the point is.
Yeah, so he uses that singular, and I think some translations say it's seed instead of seeds or something like this. But he's pointing that ultimately it culminates in a single offspring, Jesus, and not the offsprings plural, if you will, and that the promise comes through Jesus.
And so if the promises made to Abraham then are to Jesus, then that means that they're not to all the rest of the Jewish people. Why is that important for him to establish?
Well, one, he's got to establish that it's not purely something that you inherit, by your bloodline and things of this sort. But two, he's got to explain why, for Jews who haven't accepted Jesus, what are the implications here and stuff like this. But he kind of establishes that, this promise then that's going to be a means of, received by grace and faith, and not simply, you can't just say, well, I come from Abraham, so I've got it.
Right. And so it undermines really the foundation of everything that the Judaizers are teaching, which is that you have to become a Jew to become a Christian. If the promise only applies to Christ, then becoming a Jew makes absolutely no difference in your standing as receiving that promise through Christ himself. And I find that that's a really interesting argument and a very powerful argument, even though I think it goes over our heads most of the time. Now, if that's the case, then what is the reason for the law? What's the purpose for the law?
So I'll let Paul's words stand it. In chapter 3, verse 19, it says, "Why then the law? It was added because of transgressions, until the offspring should come to whom the promise had been made, and it was put in place through angels by intermediary." Now, an intermediary implies that more than one, but God is one. But ultimately it's saying, why then the law? Well, it's added because of transgressions, but it kind of implies further that it somehow it's to make us see our utter sinfulness. It's to actually amplify our sinfulness in our own eyes, if you will, and lead us to Christ.
Yeah. So we can see how desperate of situation we are really in, and I think it does a number of really interesting things here. It maybe keeps them from devolving into what they might have devolved to. It helps them to understand the Messiah, when he gets here, obviously he's going to be different than everybody else who's sinning. But the interesting thing is that it does nothing for you as far as salvation is concerned. Why would the Jewish people fall into the trap of thinking that it does?
You know, if you read the Old Testament and go through it, it does seem, you know, that God places a premium on keeping the law and things of his sort. And I don't know that it was inherently obvious to most that they weren't going to be able to do it, that it was impossible, and that they were going to need a Savior to represent man who was perfect.
It's funny because when as a Christian, when you read through the Old Testament, it becomes very repetitive of this idea of Israel sinning, and then the prophets pointing out their sin and impending judgment. Then some kind of judgment happens. It happens so often over such a long period of time. It becomes tiresome to read the story, and yet somehow out of that, what the Jewish people got is, well, we're doing a good job. How is it possible that they did that?
I think it's human nature. I mean, I can see this as a microcosm in my own life. I can see it in the life of our country, of other countries. I mean, this is the story of humanity repeated over and over again.